You know the scene. We've all been there. You're standing in the express checkout lane, you look up, and you see the sign. For some people, those words are like nails on a chalkboard, and they kick off one of the most persistent grammar debates out there.
Right. The sign says 10 items or less. And for so many of us, a little voice just screams, no, 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 it should be fewer items. It just feels like such an obvious, simple mistake. But what if it's not? What if the real story behind that sign is way more complicated and, frankly, way more interesting than just a simple error?
Because the truth is, this isn't about some new, modern problem with language. The real answer to whether that sign is wrong is wrapped up in a story that started over 1,000 years ago, long, long before a supermarket ever existed. So this whole debate, it's not really just about one word versus another. It's actually a clash between two totally different ways of looking at language itself. Okay, so on one side of the ring, you've got prescriptive grammar. You can think of this as the official rulebook. It tells you how language should be used, no exceptions. But on the other side, you have descriptive grammar. This approach doesn't really care about rules, it just observes and describes how people actually use language in the real world. And that supermarket sign, well, it's basically their battleground. So let's start with the official rulebook. What's the actual rule that makes so many people absolutely certain that 10 items or less is just plain wrong? It really all boils down to two kinds of nouns. First up, we have count nouns. And these are exactly what they sound like. Things you can count. You know, one item, two items. One dog, two dogs. They're separate individual things. And then you've got mass nouns. These are the things you can't really count individually. Stuff like water, time, or information. You don't say you have 3 informations, right? You have an amount of it. You measure it, you don't count it. So the prescriptive rule, when you lay it out like this, seems super simple. If you're talking about count nouns, things you can count, you have to use fewer. If you're talking about mass nouns, things you measure, you use less. So fewer items, less water. Easy, right? Case closed. Well, not so fast, because it turns out this so-called unbreakable law is actually pretty new. And the mistake people get so worked up about, it's ancient. Now, this is where the story gets really good. The very first recorded time someone used less with something you can count was King Alfred the Great. We're talking way back in the year 888. The rule that says you can't do that wasn't even suggested until 1770. A grammarian named Robert Baker just mentioned it was his personal preference. It then took until the 1900s for people to start treating his opinion like a sacred, unbreakable law. And here's the actual evidence. This is the line from King Alfred himself. It translates to, with less words or with more. That's right, less words. He said it almost 900 years before some guy invented a rule against it. So, why was this okay back then? Well, because in Old English, less words was totally fine. It meant something like a smaller amount of speech. They weren't thinking of words as individual items to be counted, but as a total substance, an amount to be measured. Kind of like how we think about water. That history alone is a huge plot twist. But it gets even more interesting when we look at how our modern brains handle all this. Because it turns out we still kind of think like King Alfred, which is why saying less for countable things can feel so natural. Just think about it for a second. When was the last time you said, I have fewer than $20? Probably never, right? We all say less than $20. And we do the same thing with time and distance and weight. In these cases, using less with things you can technically count, like dollars or years or miles, is completely normal. It's just what we do. So what's going on in our heads? Well, our brain is doing this really cool little mental flip. When we hear $20, we don't actually picture 20 separate $1 bills. Our mind just lumps it all together and thinks of it as a single, collective amount of money. Same for 5 years. We see that as one chunk of time. This here shows that mental switch perfectly. If you say fewer than 10 coins, your brain goes into counting mode. You're picturing individual objects. But the second you say less than $10, your brain flips over to measuring mode. It's no longer about the individual pieces. It's about one single sum of money. And this thinking also explains why we say things like, that's one less worry. I mean, just try to say one fewer worry out loud. It sounds awful, right? It's clunky and weird. It's a perfect example of how the way we actually speak can totally override some rigid, formal rule.
All right, let's tie all of this together. We've got the official rule, we've got the ancient history, and we've got the brain science. So what's the final verdict on that supermarket sign?
The reality is, English kind of has two systems running at the same time. If you're doing some very formal writing, using fewer is a good way to signal that you know and respect the traditional rules. But when we're talking about measurements like time and money, or just in our everyday conversations, less is incredibly common. It connects all the way back to that ancient usage and just fits the way our brains work. So at the end of the day, the big takeaway is this. The choice between fewer and less isn't really about being right or wrong. It's about context. It's about formality. Are you writing a formal essay for a professor, or are you writing a sign that thousands of busy shoppers need to understand in half a second? Your audience and your purpose are what really decide the correct word.
Which leaves us with one last big question. As less continues to be used more and more in these situations, is fewer a word that's on its way out? Is it going to become one of those old, archaic words we barely use? Or will it always stick around as that special tool, that clear mark of precision we save for our most formal language? That supermarket sign, it turns out, isn't just a sign. It's a little snapshot of our language caught in the middle of a slow, constant evolution.